My name is Rachel Coleman. I am 33 years old, and tonight my parents left everything to my brother. The attorney's office smelled like lemon polish and old paper. The wall clock ticked like a metronome for humiliation. Ethan adjusted his shiny watch and didn't meet my eyes. Thomas cleared his throat. Linda smiled too sweet and said, "You're so capable, honey. You'll be fine." The signatures looked like small knives. I stood, smoothed my blazer, and let the silence harden around us. But what they didn't know was that I keep. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from, and hit like and subscribe if you've ever been betrayed by family. Betrayal may look like polished smiles across a dinner table, or it may sound like a lawyer reading your name as if it's an afterthought. Either way, if you've ever carried the weight alone while someone else got the applause, this story will. I grew up in a house where Sunday dinners looked like rituals of love, but felt like quiet audits. The table gleamed under the chandelier, roast chicken steaming, the sound of silverware and polite laughter ringing in my ears. But if you looked closer, you'd see where attention pooled. Ethan, my older brother by 2 years, always sat at the center seat, his stories ballooning into applause. My chair was somewhere near the end, close enough to serve dishes, far enough that my words often drowned under the clink of forks. At 16, I had imagined birthdays would mark something sacred. Mine came with drizzle on the windows and the smell of frosting heavy with artificial vanilla. My parents slid a small box across the table, a set of secondhand books, worn covers and pencil notes from a stranger. I smiled, said thank you, and felt the silence settle. 2 weeks later, Ethan's birthday arrived like a parade, the driveway filled with neighbors, cousins, and noise. He unwrapped a gleaming motorbike, red paint catching the sun, gas fumes sharp in the air as he revved it proudly. The cheering went on past dark. I swallowed my disappointment, but it settled heavy, like lead that never dissolves. High school ended with a cap and gown and a speech. I was valedictorian, standing in the gym that smelled of floor polish and popcorn, my voice steady as it echoed in the bleachers. The applause felt polite, like people clapping because they had to. That night, we celebrated at Applebee's with a small cake that tasted like cardboard sweetness. 2 weeks later, Ethan scored a goal at a regional soccer match. The backyard lit up with fireworks, music blasting from rented speakers, relatives flooding in with casseroles. His name ricocheted off every wall while mine faded like chalk in the rain. It wasn't the money that burned, it was the enthusiasm they saved only for him. College cracked the gap wider. I won a partial scholarship, but tuition still loomed like a cliff. Mornings, I pulled espresso shots in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt milk and ambition. Nights, I shelved books at the library, fingertips dusty from spines that hadn't been touched in years. On weekends, I swung hammers for my uncle's renovation crew, blisters singing beneath my gloves. My parents praised my work ethic, but their checkbook stayed closed. Ethan's university bills, tuition, housing, meal plan, even allowance were paid without question. When I asked why, my father gave me a smile sharpened by logic. "Ethan isn't as independent as you, Rachel. He needs support." The sentence landed like a door locking from the inside. Independence became the excuse to deny me what I'd earned. I didn't know it then, but that line would echo in every demand that followed. At Thanksgiving that year, I drove home through sleet, windshield wipers scraping rhythm against the storm. The house glowed warm, smells of turkey and cinnamon pie curling out of the windows. Inside, the dining table was set like a magazine spread. Ethan, back from college with mediocre grades and inflated charm, sat at the center. His stories, half-truths, and exaggerations drew laughter like moths to porch light. I found my seat at the far end, near the kids' table, the sound of the TV football game seeping through. When I spoke about a paper I'd written, my words landed in silence, then evaporated as Ethan cracked a joke. My fork felt heavier than it should. I cut my turkey, chewed, and swallowed the silence. By 25, the ledger of sacrifices had already thickened. Ethan's first business, a boutique sports shop, collapsed before it truly opened. Shelves stocked with jerseys, the cash register still smelling like new plastic. He stood in the wreckage, hands wide, excuses taller than the inventory. My parents came to me with voices dipped in urgency. "Just a small loan, Rachel. You're the practical one. You'll understand." I signed the check, pen pressing grooves into the paper, $15,000 gone in a breath. My father called me our rock, as if reliability was the highest honor. The store closed anyway, windows covered in brown paper by winter. My money gone, my gratitude dismissed. I didn't know it then, but rescuing Ethan would become their tradition and my trap. My own beginning was far humbler. I rented an office above a bait shop, dust drifting like tired confetti in the narrow sunlight. The floorboards creaked. The walls smelled faintly of fish and mildew. I slept on a roll-up mattress behind filing cabinets, invoices stacked like bricks around me, 80-hour weeks blurred into ladders, paint samples, and borrowed coffee. But Michelle Design grew one bathroom remodel, then a kitchen, then a small clinic. My hands toughened, but I wrote every check carefully, reinvesting into tools, crew, insurance, one rusted truck that never failed me. Clients shook my hand like I'd poured every slab myself. Effort started whispering its own applause. Sunday dinners remained the same theater. Ethan's latest venture, a tech startup with buzzwords and no backbone, was praised as visionary. My company's steady growth was nice. Linda's voice carried both sweetness and barbs. "You're so independent, Rachel. We hardly worry about you. But Ethan, well, he needs us. That's why family steps in." I nodded, chewing roast beef gone cold, wine sour in my throat. One evening, over dishes and soap bubbles, Linda sighed. "Property taxes are climbing. If you could just help us keep the house safe, it would mean everything." I set up an automatic transfer, $2,800 every month. Indefinite, no contract, no questions. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself fairness would catch up. I didn't know it then, but I had just agreed to finance a secret they were hiding. Not everyone in the family wore blinders. Aunt Grace, my father's sister, lived alone in a weathered colonial 2 blocks over. She smoked on her porch swing, the orange glow of her cigarette moving like a slow heartbeat. One summer night, she called me over after dinner. "Rachel," she said, exhaling smoke into the dark, "you think your independence makes you safe. But in this family, they reward collapse and punish strength. They'll keep feeding Ethan's failures and expect you to applaud. Don't let them." Her words stung sharper than the mosquitoes buzzing my ankles. I didn't know it then, but Aunt Grace had already seen the pattern I was still trying to deny. Years stacked up like bricks on wet mortar. Ethan failed again, a bar this time. Neon sign flickering, sticky floors, glasses unwashed. 8 months after its grand opening, the lights went dark, chairs stacked on tables like tombstones. My parents called it bad timing, never bad choices. I was the one who wrote checks, again and again, covering roof repairs, plumbing, Dad's medical bills. The neighborhood noticed. Mr. Jenkins, my gray-haired neighbor, waved from his porch one night as I came home with receipts spilling out of my bag. "Another rescue mission?" he asked kindly. His eyes told me he already knew the truth my family pretended not to. I didn't know it then, but every penny, every transfer, every sacrifice was being stacked against me like a silent case file. And one day, they would use my very strength as the reason to erase me entirely. By my late 20s, I had stopped expecting applause. I learned to translate silence into fuel. Every project finished, every client referral, every employee I hired became my private ceremony. My victories lived in invoices and blueprints, not in champagne toasts at the Coleman dining table. Ethan, meanwhile, drifted from one dream to the next like a balloon losing helium. But no matter how deflated he became, my parents were always there with more strings, more excuses, more money. There was a night I can't forget, Christmas Eve, snow drifting outside in thick white veils. Our family gathered around the tree, glowing with golden lights. I unwrapped a modest sweater, cream-colored, folded carefully. Linda smiled as if generosity lived in wool. Ethan tore open box after box, an expensive leather jacket, the newest gaming console, a set of golf clubs. The sound of torn wrapping paper and his laughter filled the room. I folded the sweater back neatly into the box, telling myself warmth was enough. But what burned colder than the snow outside was not the difference in gifts, it was the difference in joy. Their cheers were never meant for me. One summer, the heat clung heavy as tar, and Ethan's latest venture, a wellness lounge in downtown Boston, was already bleeding red. He pulled me aside during Sunday dinner, his voice low but urgent. "Rach, you could just loan me $50,000. You'll get it back in a month, 2 max. You know I'll make it work." His breath smelled of beer and desperation. I said no for the first time. The silence at the table afterward wasn't just disappointment, it was judgment. My father's fork clattered. "You're her brother. She should support you, my mother added softly. She's always been stubborn. I excused myself, walked outside, and leaned against the car, trying to breathe. The night smelled like overcooked meat and unspoken threats. I had learned early that in my family, love was a transaction, and silence was the receipt. But I kept paying. When Dad's chest tightened and surgery loomed, I signed another check, $32,000 this time. I postponed upgrading company equipment, slept again in my office with invoices for pillows. Gratitude came, yes, but it was gratitude, laced with expectation. Rachel, we don't know what we'd do without you, Linda whispered at the hospital bedside. I almost believed it was love. Later, when Ethan bragged about how family always comes through, I realized it wasn't gratitude at all. It was entitlement. The automatic transfers for the house became routine $2,800, leaving my account every month. The sound of numbers clicking away on my banking app. I told myself it was to protect our family's legacy, to keep the Coleman home safe. The old colonial with its red bricks and ivy climbing the walls was the stage for every memory I had. I couldn't bear to see it lost. But one night, curiosity itched, and I asked my mother about the rising property taxes. She hesitated, eyes darting, then quickly changed the subject. The unease stuck. I didn't know it then, but the truth about that mortgage would later collapse everything. Amidst this, I found Mark Turner. He was a banker with steady hands and a warm voice, someone who knew how to listen without judgment. He became my anchor, the calm at the edge of the storm. When dinners ended in headaches, he poured wine and told me I was stronger than I knew. When I doubted myself, he brushed hair from my face and said, "You're building an empire. They'll regret overlooking you." I clung to his certainty, not knowing that his loyalty had cracks hidden beneath. There was another flash of clarity one rainy Thanksgiving. Aunt Grace pulled me aside into her kitchen, the smell of apple pie filling the air, windows fogged. She pressed an envelope into my hand. "You didn't get this from me," she muttered. Inside was a photocopy of an old draft of my parents' will. Assets split evenly, half for Ethan, half for me. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "Revised per Thomas and Linda. Rachel is stable. Ethan needs security." I stared at the ink until the words blurred. Stability had become my crime. My success, my independence used as evidence to cut me out. Grace touched my arm, her eyes tired. "Don't let them tell you this is love. It's strategy. And one day, you'll need to decide how to answer." By 32, I was the quiet financier of their chaos. Ethan's failed bar, his half-baked app idea, his credit card debt, all patched by me, usually through guilt packaged in soft words from Linda or stern orders from Thomas. I told myself I was helping family, protecting the house, preserving dignity, but the truth was, I was bleeding out in silence. The final wound before the attorney's office came disguised as Sunday dinner again. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the usual script. Ethan announced another venture this time, a sleek co-working space for creatives. My parents clapped, already talking about equity, renovations, promising him the house would back him. Then, as if on cue, Linda turned to me. "You'll help cover until the business finds its feet, won't you? You're so dependable." My fork froze. For once, I didn't answer. I let silence stretch long and uncomfortable. Ethan rolled his eyes. "Don't act like money's a problem for you. You're loaded." That sentence hit harder than any debt collector's knock, years of sacrifice erased with one dismissive shrug. That night, I drove home through Boston's cold streets, headlights streaking across rain-slick pavement. My reflection in the windshield looked like a stranger, tired, worn, invisible. I parked, sat in the car with the engine ticking, and asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Was I helping them, or was I training them to use me? The silence inside the car answered for me. The weeks that followed blurred into contracts, invoices, sleepless nights. Then came the call from the attorney's office. "Your parents want to discuss estate planning," the assistant said, voice clipped and professional. I packed my best blazer, smoothed my hair into a bun, and walked into that polished room believing, for one fragile second, that fairness might finally come. The room smelled of lemon polish and cold coffee, papers stacked like quiet weapons. Ethan leaned back, expensive watch glinting under the fluorescent light. My parents sat stiff, like actors rehearsing grief, and then the words, "All assets to Ethan. Rachel receives personal items of sentimental value." My ears rang, my stomach churned. The house, the investments, the accounts gone to him. For me, a recipe book, a set of baseball cards, an afterthought. Linda's smile trembled, brittle. You've built your own business, Rachel. You're strong. Ethan needs this more than you, Thomas added. We know you'll be fine. You always are. The attorney's pen scratched across the paper. My pulse hammered. Strength had become punishment. Success had become exile. I stood slowly, smoothing my blazer, and looked at each of them. My voice was flat, cold. Thank you for your time. Chairs scraped. My parents called after me, but I didn't look back. The hallway smelled of disinfectant. The elevator hummed as it carried me down, and in that metallic box, I made a vow. That day, I stopped being their provider. That day, I became their reckoning. The weeks after the will reading were quieter than I expected. My parents didn't call, Ethan didn't text, and Sunday dinners went on without me. But silence in my family was never absence, it was strategy. And sure enough, it didn't take long before their campaign began. It started with whispers. A client pulled me aside after a meeting, his voice careful. Rachel, your mother mentioned you've been under stress lately. Said maybe you're taking on too much? The words sat heavy in the air. I smiled, brushed it off, but my stomach tightened. Linda had been planting seeds, subtle questions about my stability, disguised as concern. By the time I heard the same story from a second colleague, I knew it wasn't an accident. They weren't just cutting me out of the will. They were cutting at my reputation, one rumor at a time. Then came the ambush at my office. Thomas arrived unannounced, his presence filling the lobby like a storm cloud. Claire, my assistant, looked rattled as she called me out. He didn't sit when I asked him to. He stood tall, voice booming. This childish act of cutting us off ends now. You have responsibilities, Rachel. My hands curled tight around the edge of my desk. I've already fulfilled them 10 times over. His eyes narrowed. You'll regret this stubbornness. Family doesn't turn its back. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't shout. I said only, leave my office, or I'll call security. For the first time in my life, my father blinked before I did. He left, but the echo of his footsteps lingered long after. Ethan's failures followed the usual pattern. His tech startup, an app that did nothing but burn cash, collapsed in under a year. Creditors circled, debts piled up. One evening, my mother called, her voice soft as honey. Your brother's in trouble again, dear. He needs help to get back on his feet. I stayed silent. She pressed harder. Don't you care about your own blood? We raised you better than this. My chest tightened, but I let the silence stretch. She finally sighed. I'll talk to him. Maybe he can find someone else. That someone else was code for me. Always me. But not this time. Then came the mortgage revelation. I'd long suspected my monthly transfers weren't just covering taxes. One afternoon, Claire handed me an envelope she found slipped under our office door, a bank notice addressed to my parents. Past due on a second mortgage. Payment, $2,800. The exact amount I had been transferring. My pulse hammered. They hadn't needed me to save the house. They'd borrowed against it to funnel cash into Ethan's sinking dreams. I stared at the paper until the ink blurred, heat spreading in my chest like fire. Every dollar I had sent was part of a lie. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, receipts spread like cards in a losing hand. I highlighted line after line. Ethan's tuition, Dad's surgery, mortgage transfers, business bailouts. The numbers piled higher than I could bear. Over $175,000, not counting the sleepless nights. I stapled, notarized, filed. For once, I didn't cry. I didn't even shake. I felt something colder than rage, something sharper. It was clarity, but clarity didn't stop the next betrayal. One Friday evening, Claire texted me a photo. Mark, my boyfriend, sitting in a booth at a dimly lit bar with Ethan, their heads bent close, expressions tight. The timestamp glared at me. Later, Mark came home, smelling faintly of beer. He kissed my cheek and said, Ethan's worried about you. Maybe you should be more flexible. They are your family after all. The floor seemed to tilt under me. My anchor wasn't steady after all. He was a leak, feeding my brother information, working to soften me up. I smiled coldly, kissed him back, and said nothing. But inside, another wall cracked. The following week, Aunt Grace called me over. Her kitchen smelled of onions and simmering broth. her hands shaking as she slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of emails between my parents and their attorney drafts of the will that had once split assets evenly. In the margins, notes in my father's handwriting. Rachel doesn't need it. Ethan, insecure, must secure his future. My mother's scrawl added, Rachel is too independent. I shut the folder, bile rising in my throat. Independence, once my shield, had been twisted into a sentence. Aunt Grace put her hand on mine. They're not just careless, Rachel. They're deliberate. Don't let them bury you under the weight of their lies. I drove home that night with headlights bouncing off wet pavement, the folder on the passenger seat like a bomb ticking. I didn't know when it would go off, but I knew I would be the one to decide where it landed. The smear campaign escalated. By the end of the month, I had cousins texting me, awkwardly asking if I was okay. One even added, your mom said you've been really stressed. Maybe overworked? It was subtle, but the implication was sharp. Unstable, unreliable, maybe even unfit to run my business. That narrative, left unchecked, could corrode everything I had built. I drafted a timeline of receipts, notarized documents, and transfer slips. Aunt Grace read it twice, then called me with fire in her voice. They can't twist this anymore, Rachel. Not when you've got the truth printed in black and white. Meanwhile, the bank notices kept coming. Each one carried the same number, $2,800, echoing like a cruel joke. The debt wasn't shrinking. It was growing. Ethan's latest co-working venture was already sputtering, and he had the nerve to message me, if you care about this family, you'll step up. I stared at the text until my vision blurred. My reply was one word. No. The following Sunday, I drove past the old Coleman house out of habit. The curtains were open, lights on, but the warmth I remembered was gone. Through the window, I saw Margaret, one of Linda's friends, walking from room to room with a notepad, pointing at furniture. My stomach clenched. They weren't protecting the home. They were preparing to liquidate it. And yet, they still expected me to keep paying into a sinking ship. One night, Mark tried again. We were eating takeout at my kitchen counter, cartons spread between us. He leaned back, chopsticks tapping against his bowl. I think you're being too rigid. They're your parents, Rachel. Ethan's your brother. Can't you be the bigger person? Just this once? I set down my fork, my appetite gone. Just this once? Mark, it's been 20 years of just this once. His jaw tightened. You're making it sound worse than it is. His words, soft but dismissive, hurt more than if he had shouted. That was when I knew he didn't see the pattern. Or worse, he chose not to. 2 weeks later, Ethan showed up at one of my job sites, uninvited. He wore a smug grin, leaning against a stack of lumber as if he owned it. Heard you're doing well. Look, I need another 20. Just a bridge until the space fills up. My crew stopped working, their eyes on me. I wiped sawdust from my hands, my voice calm but icy. Ask the people who inherited everything. I'm not your bank anymore. His grin faltered, twisting into anger. Don't forget who you're talking to. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. No, Ethan, don't forget who you're talking to. For once, he left first. My hands shook when he was gone, but not from fear, from release. The final crack before the storm came through Claire. She slipped into my office one morning, her phone in hand, her face pale. You need to see this. It was an email, forwarded from Mark to Ethan weeks earlier. Attached was a financial snapshot of my accounts, personal and business. My stomach dropped. Every detail I'd ever shared with Mark in trust had been passed along to my brother. Notes in Ethan's voice trailed beneath. She's liquid. She can handle it. Just push her. I felt the world tilt, betrayal hitting from both sides. Claire put a hand on my shoulder. You can't fight blind anymore. You need to show them everything. That night, I sat in my office long past midnight. The printer hummed as I fed it documents, ledgers of every bailout, bank statements of every transfer, notarized records, pages stacked into a binder thick enough to knock the air out of anyone who opened it. At the very top, I slipped a cover sheet with one word: reckoning. When the call came, Thomas insisting on a family discussion the following Sunday, I didn't hesitate. Fine, I said. I'll be there. My voice was steady, almost calm. He probably mistook it for surrender, but I knew it was the sound of the floor shifting beneath him. By then, the fear was gone. What replaced it was colder, sharper, unyielding. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into a Coleman dinner as their provider. I was walking in as their mirror. The Sunday they summoned me, Boston's air carried the first bite of winter. Leaves skittered across the pavement as I pulled into the driveway of the Coleman house. The windows glowed warmly, but to me, the place looked like a stage where a play was about to collapse. I stepped out, binder tucked under my arm, heels clicking on the walkway. Behind me, David Miller, my attorney, followed with a calm that carried more weight than any threat. Inside, the dining room was set like always. Roast beef on a platter, candles lit, silverware gleaming. My parents sat at their usual places, Ethan lounging with his smirk, Linda smoothing the tablecloth like she was hosting a holiday, not an execution. Mark was there too, uninvited, leaning back in his chair as if he belonged at that table more than I did. Aunt Grace sat off to the side, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp, and in the corner, almost invisible, Mr. Jenkins had been invited by Grace, a silent witness. "Rachel," Thomas said, his voice heavy with authority, "we're here to put an end to this nonsense." Linda chimed in sweetly. "Honey, families fight, but at the end of the day, we must stick together. Ethan needs stability, and you have so much already. Can't you see that?" Ethan leaned forward, his watch glinting. "Quit making this dramatic. You're fine. You always land on your feet. Stop acting like you're the victim." I didn't sit. I placed the binder on the table and slid it toward David. He opened it, flipped the pages with the practiced ease of a surgeon, and began to read. Tuition for Ethan Coleman, private university, $14,250, paid by Rachel Coleman. His voice was flat, precise. The room stiffened. Medical bills, Thomas Coleman, bypass surgery and aftercare, $32,475, paid by Rachel Coleman. Linda's hands tightened on the tablecloth. Home repairs, roof, plumbing, electrical, Coleman residence, $20,500, paid by Rachel Coleman. Coleman residence. Ethan scoffed. "So what? That's what family does." David didn't look at him. He turned the page. Monthly mortgage transfers over 6 years, $2,800 each, totaling $90,000, paid by Rachel Coleman. The numbers hit like blows. The silence grew thicker with each entry. David continued. Total contributions, $175,225, excluding time, labor, and opportunity cost. Each payment notarized, each record certified, copies filed with the county clerk. I watched as my father's jaw tightened, as Linda's eyes darted toward Ethan, as his smirk flickered. Then David flipped to the next tab. Additionally, mortgage records show the Coleman residence refinanced 3 years ago, cashing out $275,000. Funds traced to investments in Ethan Coleman's failed ventures. He lifted his gaze, piercing. This matches precisely the monthly transfers Rachel was told were for property taxes. In truth, they were covering a loan Rachel never knew about. Linda gasped, a hand to her chest. "That's not how." Aunt Grace cut in, her voice sharp. "That's exactly how. I told you this would come out." Thomas slammed his fist against the table, rattling the silverware. "This is private family business." "Not anymore," David said evenly. "Defamation has already left the room. Smears about Rachel's stability have been noted by colleagues. Harassment documented. If this continues, restraining orders and legal action will follow." Ethan shot up from his chair, face flushed. "You can't do this. You're my sister." I finally spoke, my voice calm, cold. "I'm not your bank. I'm not your safety net. I'm not your scapegoat. I'm your mirror." The room froze. My words cut through the candlelight like glass breaking. Mark, desperate, tried to salvage the moment. "Rachel, you're taking this too far. We talked about this." Claire's voice rang from the doorway. She had slipped in quietly behind us. She held up her phone, displaying the forwarded email. "You mean when you sent her financials to Ethan?" "Don't bother denying it. I saved the metadata." Mark paled, stammering. Ethan swore under his breath. The weight in the room shifted. For the first time in my life, the authority my parents carried crumbled. Their power wasn't a wall anymore, it was paper, thin and flammable. David closed the binder, pushing it toward the center of the table. One copy. The truth in black and white. Do with it what you will. But know this. Rachel is prepared, documented, and no longer silent. I stood straighter, sliding my chair back without ever sitting. My blazer brushed against my wrist as I adjusted it, my pulse steady. You can call me stubborn. You can call me cold. But you will never call me your provider again. Linda whispered, voice trembling. Rachel, please don't destroy this family. I gave her a small smile, not cruel but cold. I didn't destroy it. You did. I just stopped funding the illusion. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting, thicker than tears. I turned, walked to the door, and left the binder behind like a detonated truth. When the door shut behind me, the house sounded different, lighter, like the weight had finally shifted. I drove away from the Coleman house, with the city lights flickering against my windshield. The binder was behind me, sitting on their table like a live grenade, but in my lap I carried something far sharper: silence. Silence that I had chosen. Silence that was no longer submission but control. For the first time in years, my phone didn't buzz with demands. No urgent texts about bills. No calls about Ethan's next big thing. Just quiet. I rolled down the window, letting the cold Boston air cut across my face, and I felt taller than I ever had inside their house. But make no mistake, this wasn't over. I knew my parents. I knew Ethan. They would scramble, deny, twist, and call me cruel. They would gather sympathy from anyone willing to listen. They would say family doesn't betray family. But I had the ledger. I had notarized truth, financial statements, Claire's digital evidence, Aunt Grace's testimony. They thought they could erase me with a pen stroke. But what they didn't realize was that I'd been writing my own story all along. At my office later that night, I opened the drawer of my desk and slid out another file, one even my attorney hadn't seen yet. A separate ledger, marked in red. It was a timeline of every rumor they'd spread, every call they'd made to clients, every whisper that tried to chip away at me. And attached to it were affidavits, recordings, names. It wasn't just numbers anymore. It was intent. Malicious, documented, undeniable. I traced my finger over the cover, the word counterclaim scrawled across it in my handwriting. This wasn't just defense anymore. It was offense. They thought they had cornered me. In truth, they had handed me the weapon I needed to turn the tables entirely. The Colemans would learn that betrayal doesn't dissolve in silence. It calcifies. It sharpens. And when it comes back, it doesn't knock. It breaks the door. I closed the file, locked it back into the drawer, and leaned into my chair. The city hummed beyond the glass, unaware of the small war being drafted in an office of steel and light. My hands were steady. My breath was calm. And in the calm, I realized something chilling. They hadn't destroyed me. They had built me into exactly what they feared most. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like mine aren't just tales, they're warnings, reminders, and proof that survival can turn into strength. Drop a comment below if you've ever carried more than your share, if you've ever been told you're too strong to need help. Share this video with someone who needs to know they're not alone. And don't forget, this story isn't over. The Colemans may have written me out of their will, but I'm writing the ending. Stay tuned.